Feeling trapped by spiritual abuse and wondering if there's a way out? In this video, we'll uncover the hidden signs of toxic faith, the emotional toll it takes, and practical steps to reclaim your identity and rebuild your faith. Don't miss this eye-opening guide to freedom and healing. Many of you know that I was excommunicated by Bethlehem Baptist in Minnesota for divorcing my husband of 25 years. At the time of my official excommunication, I was already attending and volunteering at another church with my children. The elders at Bethlehem Baptist followed me to my new church and set up a meeting with the elders there to warn them about me. And the only reason I know that is because the head of my new church's elder board called me after that meeting to tell me about it. And he didn't give me any details, but he just wanted to encourage me that they were in full support of my family and myself being part of their church family. Now, keep in mind that I had not been going to Bethlehem Baptist for a couple of years by this time, and I was not a dangerous human being. My entire life since I was a young teenager had been about heavy involvement in churches, volunteering in music ministry and children's ministry for decades. I was a faithful wife. I was a homeschooling mom. I worked hard to take responsibility for my own life, my own parenting, and the emotions of my immature husband. And I had reached out for help in humility and full honesty numerous times in both of the churches that my husband and I had been members of during the course of our marriage. But I was not given help. However, I was given lots of advice. Lots of shame was heaped upon me for even requesting help in the first place. And I tell my story in my own spiritual memoir, All the Scary Little Gods, which you can get on Amazon. But I share this quick overview as a backdrop for our interview today, because 2 years after my excommunication, I read a book called Broken Trust, and it was very comforting to me at the time. It was validating because it put words to the spiritual abuse that I had endured for decades and had just assumed was normal church behavior. Today, I am grateful to be able to bring to you an interview with the author of Broken Trust, Remy Diedrich. Remy is a seasoned pastor and spiritual consultant. Over the course of 3 decades of ministry, he has authored 6 books that offer practical guidance and spiritual support for those seeking healing and connection to God. I'm going to show you 3 of them. Here's Healing the Hurts of Your Past, a guide to overcoming the pain of shame. There's Return from Exile, Overcoming Loss, Failure, and Spiritual Setbacks. If you're watching the podcast on YouTube, you'll be able to see these. Otherwise, I will put the links to these in the show notes as well. And Stuck, How to Overcome Your Anger and Reclaim Your Life. The one that we're going to be talking about mostly today is the book that I read in 2019 called Broken Trust. But Remy's expertise extends beyond the pulpit. He spent 24 years as a spiritual consultant at an addiction treatment center. And today, Remy dedicates his time to empowering pastors, which I love this, to build healthy church cultures. And he also coaches individuals on the themes that he writes about in his book. Remy is a lifelong resident, literally in my own neck of the woods, Minneapolis, Minnesota, which I thought was very interesting because I didn't know that before. And he is married with 3 adult children. So with that long introduction, welcome, Remy, to the Flying Free podcast.
Yeah, it's so nice to be with you here today, Natalie.
So I know you're not pastoring now, but can you tell us the story behind your transition out of pastoring churches? And also maybe by way of just telling us a little bit more about yourself, tell us about what, the main work that you're doing today.
Okay. Well, I founded a church called Cedarbrook Church in Menominee, Wisconsin, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from here in Minneapolis. And I pastored that for 20 years. And I had a really strong associate pastor with me, and I just felt it was time for me to get out of the way and let him spread his wings. He was a great leader, And sometimes you just need to get out of the way. And so that's
Yeah.
what I did. I figured there was plenty of things for me to do, which there are. And he's been very successful. The church has continued to grow. And I'm semi-retired, so I have a nice paced life, but I do continue to write a little bit. I haven't been writing books, but I'll post blog posts. I consult and coach pastors here and there, and I interact with a lot of people that read my works, my books, and then contact me either through coaching or through email.
Okay.
I also spend a bit of time in the South America. I've got some contacts there that I developed through the years as a pastor, and my wife and I continue to go down there and visit those churches, those pastors, just to encourage them. They're smaller works of ministry, but they're doing a good work, and so I like to go down there and encourage them in different ways.
That's amazing. How do pastors who maybe want help with this, how do they find you usually? And are they more local or do you help pastors kind of from all over if they reach out?
Well, I'm a part of the Evangelical Covenant Church, and
Okay.
there's a number of different districts within that denomination, and so they contact the district superintendents contact me when they have a pastor that they'd like me to help coach.
Okay.
But most of my in related to spiritual abuse, I typically am working with individuals who have experienced spiritual abuse, and they're looking for, well, you said it well, that the book affirmed you. And I think that's what a lot of people who've experienced spiritual abuse, they typically know what to do, but they're so indoctrinated to toe the company line, so to speak, that they're looking for some affirmation. So when they turn to me, I can just help bring some clarity to them about their situation and maybe what their next steps are, and help them not feel so guilty, because there's just a whole lot of guilt when it comes to spiritual abuse.
Yeah. So it sounds like, I mean, we do a lot of the same work as far as helping people deprogram really from the brainwashing
Yeah, exactly.
that they've been in. Yeah.
Hmm.
It is hard when you have been when that's the only environment that you've ever known and
Hmm.
that's the only way that you've ever been able to think about it. It's
Yeah,
hard to break out of that without feeling like you have violated your moral code, the moral code that's been embedded in you, and
yeah,
to learn that that doesn't have to be your moral code, that that's
I know.
actually someone else's moral code and that's not even biblical,
Yeah,
is can be really disorienting at first.
yeah. I was just speaking. Someone I did some coaching yesterday with a woman who she'd been in church, sounds like most of her life, and she was very when she opened up, she was telling about her life, and she was saying, well, I really need to be under someone's covering, and I know that's important, and I really need to be in a church if I want to flourish. And I thought that was interesting. I just took mental note, and then as she got to the end, she said, well, what do you think about this idea that I mentioned about covering? I said, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I noticed that you said that up front, and I don't think that's a biblical concept. And
Yeah.
she said, really? And so I walked her through why I felt that it was really something that people use to control and manipulate people with, and I could talk more about that if you want me to. But anyway, that it's not healthy. And she was like, oh, that I'd never thought of it in that way before. And she said, well, what about being in a church? Why do you think I can only flourish if I'm in a church? Because that's what I've been taught my whole life, that I can only flourish as a Christian if I'm in a church. I said, well, I think church is bonus. I mean, churches are great. I was a pastor, of course. I love church. I want to be a part of a church. I wish every Christian could be a part of a healthy church, but sometimes it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I said, to think that we can only flourish as a follower of Jesus if we're in a church, I think that's very limiting on God. I mean, just look at the stories in the Bible, whether it's Moses or David or Abraham. They didn't have churches at times. At times David was running from cave to cave, but yet all these three men were very tied in with God, and God used them in a powerful way, even though they weren't always connected to fellowship. So my point is that a lot of times we're indoctrinated with certain um, uh, beliefs, and those beliefs keep us constrained, and we don't even think outside of those beliefs, because, well, it's just a part of what we think Christianity is all about, until someone comes in and introduces a new idea.
Yes, exactly. Man, when you talk about covering, I remember when I first realized that my authority, because was taught, a lot about authority. You especially women had to be under authority of somebody.
Right.
If it wasn't your dad, it was your husband or your pastor or whatever. And that
Right.
was your covering. That was your safety and your protection. But the
Right.
problem was that my safety and protection on so many different levels was so unsafe. And when I found out that Jesus Christ alone was my covering, I could breathe because I realized that's my one safe place. And also, when you're not in a church or you get excommunicated from a church, you
Hmm.
are not alone. That doesn't mean that now that you're unsafe or that you don't have any protection. You have
Right.
all of the full protection that you always had. All of the love and all of the, that cocoon of love is still completely surrounding you, whether you are in a church or not. What about people who are sick? Or people
Hmm.
who are they're in a position where they can't get to church or they don't have any
Hmm.
transportation. They don't have any protection now. They don't have any covering just because they can't go to church. It's crazy.
Yeah, well said. I mean, that's
Yeah.
exactly what I was trying to communicate to this woman.
Yeah. Okay, so I read it in 2019. When did Broken Trust actually get published, and why did you decide to write that book?
I think it was 8 years ago, so that would put it back about 2016.
Okay.
So it was an interesting thing. I had written 5 books up until that time, and I was kind of done. Having written books, you understand how much work it is. It
Yeah.
sounds great
Yeah.
in the early stages. It's so exciting because you're throwing down all your thoughts, and you go, "This is amazing." When it comes to editing, it's just a lot of work, and you keep seeing, no matter how many times you read the book, you find more and more mistakes,
Yep.
and what you thought was just going to be a short project becomes, like a 2-year project. So I
Yep.
thought, okay, 5 books, I'm done. And then the church that actually, so I founded a church back in 2003 in Western Wisconsin, and the church that helped me and us get started, uh, originally they were a great evangelical church, and then they changed pastors. And this pastor who came in, when I first met him, it just felt like something was off, but he had a good resume. And but over time, he got into some really strange doctrine. I'll just give you one example. He had this theology about people bonding into these different units. So this is so strange. There was a young man in his congregation who he welcomed onto staff, and then he made him a pastor, and then he put a wedge between this young man and his family. And so he separated from his family, he disowned his parents, and then the pastor, this is this really strange thing, the pastor adopted this young man who is now his pastor, and they became like this duo. And then, but he promoted this kind of bonding, separation from your family, because all families were somehow destructive to you in your faith. And then he would create these other relationships within the church. And so this church went from being this dynamic, evangelical, outreach oriented church to this cult. So here I am, I'm 20 miles down the road from this and having some relationship with them. Initially, I tried to help out. They weren't real open to it. So I stepped back and I thought, well, how can I help people? So I had just started a website and blogs. So I started writing some initial blog posts about spiritual abuse, and not naming them specifically, but helping people understand what it is. What do I do now that I'm confronted with it? How do I handle it? And what can a church do on a global scale as well? And so thankfully, some of the people down the road did read those posts and they found them helpful. But what was really surprising to me is that those blog posts became my most popular by like 10 to 1. I mean, all those blog posts just shot to the top of my ratings. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I've hit a nerve. And this was before people really talked a lot about spiritual abuse. And so I thought, oh no, maybe I need to write a book about this. And I thought, oh, I really don't want to write a book. So I went to Amazon to see what kind of books were out there. And there's like 5 at the time. And I don't know if people know this, but you can look at the rankings of your book to see how well they're being sold. And none of these books had much, they're all like 1 million, 2 million. I mean, no one is reading these books on spiritual abuse. And
Yeah.
I thought, oh, I'm not going to write another book just to sit there and not be sold. But I kept hearing back from so many people just as a result of my blog post. I thought, even if it's for 100 people, I got to write this book. And
Mm,
so I wrote the book, and surprisingly, it's done very well. And since then, now if you go on and if you do a search for spiritual abuse on Amazon, there must be 50 books on some
yeah.
form of narcissism or spiritual abuse or church
But
hurt
they're
stuff
not
like
all
that.
good. Just saying.
I haven't read them all, but I know there's a lot of them, and so I was kind of ahead of the curve, and thankful for it. I keep getting, if you read the reviews are very favorable, and it's like I'm
Yeah.
just so grateful that God used me to encourage people in this area.
Yeah. Well, I was one of those people, and you're right. Back then, I feel like, and that wasn't that long ago either when you think about it. But I feel like there has been kind of an explosion in the last probably 5 years of
Yeah,
information, not just about church abuse, but about all kinds of different, about abuse in general, I guess. And
yeah,
I think it's a good thing because more than what it does is it empowers people to stand up and go, no, I don't have to, I can make a different choice. I can go
yeah.
to a different church. I can go to a healthy church, or I don't have to go to church at all. But
Hmm.
but it holds people that are behaving, it holds churches who are behaving in these ways a little more accountable. I'm hoping that 20 years from now, a church that behaves the way the church that I was excommunicated from behaves, that they will be just completely irrelevant in the world. They will be so dismissed as that's ridiculous, kind of.
Yeah. Well, people are voting with their feet, and when suddenly people
Exactly.
start leaving, you have to respond to that. Like we might either they're wrong or we're wrong, and hopefully, if they're honest, they'll say maybe there's some things we can do differently. Maybe we're too heavy-handed here, and
Yeah.
we need to change our ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so in Broken Trust, you explore the concept of toxic leadership within
Mhm.
churches, which goes back to the whole authority thing, which is interesting because, I think that's why authorities promote that and push that so much on people is
Mhm.
because then it cuts everyone off at the knees. You're no longer able to question them because they're your authority, right? Can you tell
Mhm.
us what toxic faith is? Maybe define that and talk about it a little bit. And also spiritual abuse. And how do we know? How does someone know that that's what they're experiencing in their religious environment? Because I don't think it's always that obvious.
Sure, sure. Well, I think toxic faith and spiritual abuse are two distinct things. So I do like to make that delineation. First, with toxic faith, it's whenever you're being encouraged to please God, that you need to do something in order for you to please God and for Him to accept you. And so once you believe that and you're every day you're thinking, okay, what do I need to do? Should I pray? Should I pray for 15 minutes? Maybe I should pray for 20 minutes. And that's what God is, you're
Yeah.
you're always questioning yourself, you're always doubting yourself, wondering if what you're doing is enough to please God and receive his blessing. So it puts all kinds of pressure on you to perform in order to please him. And then as a result, of course, because you're always going to fail, you're always doubting yourself. It creates all kinds of guilt and shame. And unfortunately, none of that brings you any closer to God. So that's what toxic faith is. And you hear it oftentimes in the things that we hear people say in church or even to yourself, like you should always do this, or God wants you to do this, or you have to do that. It reminded me of years ago, I wrote this piece, this kind of a tract on how to find God's will. And I was pretty pleased with it, being arrogant young man that I was. And so I took it to one of the elders in my church and I said, hey, I wrote this on how to find God's will. I'd appreciate your input, thinking that he would give me all kinds of great input. And he came back and he said, well, Remy, it's good, but you use the word must a lot. I
Mm,
said, what do you mean? Yeah, what's wrong with that? He said, well, it sounds heavy handed, like this is the only way you can find God's will is what you're saying. And being the clueless young man that I was, I said, well, yeah, you have to do these things. These are things you have to do to know God's will. So I totally dismissed his input. And it took me probably 20 years to go, oh, That's what he was talking about. It's this
Yeah.
attitude of there's a certain way to do everything, and if you don't, hit these notches on the list, you're not going to be able to find God's will. You're not going to be able to please God. So that's what toxic faith looks like. I think
Yeah.
spiritual abuse is a little bit different in that people take toxic faith and they weaponize it against people to manipulate people and to control people to get them to do what they want them to do so they can have their kingdom and have people serving them.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the distinction between those two things. I feel like when you think about toxic faith too, it's who gets to decide what those rules are. I feel like they're different depending on what community you're in. Also, it can change.
Absolutely.
And sometimes even I've seen even people in authority change it for themselves, you know, whereas there's a one standard for like for women, I've seen this a lot. There's one standard for women, but there's another standard for men, for
Mm-hmm.
example. There's one
Yeah.
standard for husbands and there's a different standard for wives.
And I
Um,
think there's a lot of unspoken rules too.
yeah,
Um, People just try to, through observing, they listen to how people talk and they go, oh, I guess this is what I need to do to be accepted
yes,
in this church. So I need to talk about my quiet, there's buzzwords too, like quiet time or devotions,
yeah,
which I'm not saying anything against those. Those are great. But sometimes there's a vocabulary in churches that you start to pick up and you realize that if I want to be accepted in this group, I need to use these buzzwords and kind of fall in line. And it's
yeah,
just unhealthy.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so what are some signs that a church or a spiritual community that you might be involved in might be coercive or controlling? So this would be more like the spiritual abuse, maybe. And even
Yeah.
give some examples of like how they try to control, like what are they trying to control? Why would a in some for someone who's listening who maybe has not experienced this, they could be wondering, well, what are they trying to control? How are they trying to control people?
Yeah. Well, I think there's so many different ways. In my book, I've got like a checklist of 30 different things, and that's probably only a small portion of it. But I'm trying to help people discern it and point it out because, like I said before, if you're raised in the church, there's certain things that you just accept. You don't think it's abuse. This is just what church life is all about.
Yeah,
So until someone starts to point things out and say, no, that's abuse. That shouldn't happen. That's toxic. You don't always see it. So let me just use the pastor that I was talking about as an example of a few things. Because the first thing that he did is he came up with this unique teaching that was unique to him. Like I said, I'd never heard this teaching before. I think he came up with it on his own. I don't know if he thought it was a revelation from God or what. He probably presented it that way. So you have a unique teaching that the leader associates with a divine revelation. And over time, that revelation becomes more and more prominent. If you try to speak to that leader about that teaching or anything else that you find wrong, they become very defensive about it. And then you become the enemy for pointing it out. And you don't want to get into their bad graces on that because they'll come after you. People outside of the church become the enemy because they also are questioning the validity of the teaching or of the pastor of the church as a whole. And so the church starts to become very insular. You disrespect anything or any organization or any person outside of the church. I remember when I was a new Christian years ago in a charismatic church, seminaries were put down as being a foolish, why would you go to that dead place? They call them cemeteries, not seminaries. And so people on the outside are discredited.
yes,
And the pastor becomes untouchable. You can't question the pastor. And then also this pastor, once he left and they started looking into the finances, there were all kinds of funds that were misused. He used a number of things for his personal gain. So all these things, really, you can point out some of the big things like I just did, but also it's the little things, the little things, the lies, the misrepresentations, the innuendos, and I think you need to be careful to recognize those things. When I first was talking to the elders at this church that I'm talking about here, and one man, he'd been in the church for 30 years. I knew him a little bit as an acquaintance. I knew him when, we started our church. And I said to him, I said, how could this happen? I mean, you've been a Christian for a long time, and the pastor before him was a really solid Christian. I said, what happened that this happened? This whole teaching and philosophy, this theology, could riddle the church, and no one said anything. Especially I was implying him.
Yeah.
But he said, Remy, I had all kinds of cautions in my heart. I felt he was wrong, but no one else was saying anything. Mm-hmm. And because no one else was saying anything, I thought it was probably just me, and I didn't want to rock the boat. So I just didn't say anything. And he felt really guilty about it. But I think that happens all the time. The people are so cautious. They don't want to rock the boat. The church was growing. And so they don't want to, they see blessing in the church, what they would call blessing, and they don't want to upset the blessing and then be the bad person.
Yes.
So those are just some of the things you can look for.
I know, I'm just writing down some notes here of things that I remember. In my experience, also like policing what you read, kind
Sure.
of saying these are the books and these are the authors that we endorse.
Oh, yeah.
And then don't read these people over here because this is heretical. Or saying that if you question any of the teaching, I went to one church where they said that you were unteachable then. If you had any, that was a big thing. You were either a teachable person, which implied that you're humble and you're open to direction, or you're unteachable. You're stubborn and you don't want to learn. You're not someone who wants to learn.
Yeah.
So that was scary.
Yeah, and people pointing out, I remember occasionally there's some authors that I really like, Henry Nouwen for one.
Yeah.
And I've quoted him. And sometimes especially when I quote Catholic pastors or priests, people will, in the comments section, they'll say, oh, I thought this guy was good, but he quoted this Catholic guy. He must be bad. And it's like, really? I mean, so everything I had to say, you just throw it out because I quoted someone who's Catholic, and what I quoted was true. I mean, maybe everything else about what they think is wrong, but what I quoted was very pertinent to the point that I was making, and that's why I quoted it. So there's this aversion to anything that doesn't line up fully with their way of thinking.
Yeah. When people do that on my blog or they'll send me emails or whatever, I'm just like, God bless you. We're not a want match. Right. I'm not a good match for you as far as like is someone that you want to be listening to. Go find your own people. Yeah. So how does spiritual abuse affect relationships then within your family? And well, you gave a good example. Like that one young man just walked away from his family completely and then got adopted by his new leader or whatever. But what are some other ways that it can affect your relationships with your family and your communities, based on your own experience, what you've seen?
Yeah. Well, just thinking from a church perspective, since spiritual abuse is all about control, when you feel that someone is trying to control you, that's unsafe. You go, wait a minute, that this person is not healthy, so you shut down, and now vulnerability is thrown out the window. And when you throw out vulnerability, you throw out trust. So the relationships in a church setting are all going to become very superficial. Yeah. And you might smile and you might laugh, but you're only doing that on the outside to make everyone else happy. And then when you leave, you're thinking about other thoughts, and maybe on the car ride home, you're saying different things. So in that respect, in the church, those relationships are going to be very superficial. And then in the family, one thing that I've seen a lot of is the husband and the wives don't always perceive the abuse at the same level. And that's whenever I see that, I'm like, oh no, this is not good. But men often don't sense the abuse like women do. I think women sense it more because they're often abused more. They're not respected at the same level of the men, as you referred to that already. So the men can be somewhat oblivious, or if they see it, they kind of blow it off like no big deal. Where the wife in the family might be going, no, this is a big deal. I mean, it's bad enough to be disrespected just as a woman, but now, they see it at another level. And
Mhm.
so now there's this split and it becomes a wedge in the relationship. And then you can really do one of three things. Either let's say it's the wife that senses the spiritual abuse. The wife stays at the church, but she hates it, just to keep the family together, or she leaves and goes to a separate church. And so now the family is split, going to two different churches,
Yep.
which I don't think is very healthy. Or the third thing is, and the preferred thing would be that the husband respects the wife's sensitivity and says, honestly, I don't see what you see, but if you're feeling abused, I don't want to go someplace where you're feeling abused. And he would join her to go find another church. But that doesn't always happen, and it really causes a lot of strife.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful example. And I think that would describe the first church that we were members of for years. My ex-husband and w- I I saw so much abuse happening at that church, but there was also abuse happening in our relationship, in my marriage that kind of it
Yeah,
mirrored what was going on in the church. And
yeah.
and I could see it in other couples too. It was almost like what was happening on a big scale in the church between the leaders and the congregation was
Mm-hmm.
happening on this little microcosm scale
Yeah.
in individual homes. It was so bizarre. So I was kind of pushing for, we got to get out of here. We got to try to find a better church. We got to, but I didn't even, I was so confused. I didn't call it abuse. I didn't know, I didn't have the terminology for it. I just knew there's something not right. And I didn't know. Oh gosh, I wish so bad I could go back to that person and just like download everything that I know now, but we can't do that. But I'm just glad that we're talking about this and we're having these conversations so that people can learn and have vocabulary for it and then make
Mhm.
decisions from an informed place instead of a place of utter confusion and pain, because
Yeah.
that's how it feels. It's like blinding pain that you can't explain and you know it's coming from certain people, but you don't know why, because they're doing it in such a way that they make it seem like maybe it's me, maybe it's coming from me, like maybe I'm the problem. And I didn't want to be the problem. Most of
Right.
us don't want to be the problem. We want to like be part of the solution, and we want
Yeah.
to I felt like I was constantly making bids for that connection. So when you talk about like the vulnerability not being there,
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I and other women that I saw were trying to be vulnerable to make that bid for that intimate connection with one another and with our leaders and with our faith family, really.
Mm-hmm.
And that bid for connection was being exploited. Our
Right.
vulnerability was being exploited. It was so
And that's
painful.
when you start to shut down
Yes.
because you realize it's not safe.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then you feel guilty about that because now you're not connecting in the way that you really feel like God wants you to connect. But yeah, it's crazy. It's really, really insane. Anyway, that's why your book was so important to me at the time and
Yeah.
helped me break free. Knew I knew more by that time, but just having someone else write it down in words that were so clear, I was like, yes, 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 I can't believe this. So it was really, really good. So if anyone's listening and you are feeling like that, or you're in a religious environment and you're feeling that kind of confusion, just even clearing up confusion can help. It doesn't mean that you have to make any decision or you have to leave your church or anything drastic like that, but just clearing up that confusion will help you settle emotionally inside of yourself. And then from that place, you can make decisions about what you want to do down the road. But
Yeah. I thought of another example of
oh,
toxic
good.
faith. It just kind of came to my mind, and it's so subtle. That's why I want to mention it. But we were at this church years ago, and the only people that could serve in the church other than the nursery were men, even like ushers. So there was no place for women, and we just kind of accepted that because we were in a small town, and that was the church, and we lived with it, but we recognized that that was not healthy. But then we were talking to one of our daughters once and just saying, hey, what would you like to do with your life? Where would you like to go? And she mentioned a bunch of things. And my wife said, do you ever think of ministry? Because of our ministry, just wondered if she had any interest in ministry. She goes, oh, well, I didn't think I could do that. And we said, well, why did you think that? Because we never talked like that. She
Yeah.
said, well, there's no women leaders at church. I just assumed that women can't be leaders in the church. And we just looked at each other. My wife and I looked at each other like, oh my gosh, something that we were filtering out, sometimes you just have to do that. I'm going to go to this church and filter out the toxic stuff. Our kids weren't filtering it out, and they were sucking that up, and that was becoming a part of their life. And
Yeah.
so sometimes we underestimate the impact that these little things can have, and it's so important for us to, for example, it's important for a husband, like, if I'm filtering out all this stuff, don't assume that your wife or your children are filtering it out. They
Yeah.
might be absorbing it and feeling suppressed and oppressed by the church. And so I think those are good discussions that could be had in a family, is how does this treat you? I remember, again, the same daughter came home. So she went to the church school. The church had a school. And she came home and she was telling me about all the um, how the principal and the teacher were so strict about this and or that. And there were really silly things that I can't remember what they were. They were just silly. And I just had to tell her, I said, honey, sometimes in a church, people have a lot of rules and they mean well by them. But in this case, I think I agree with you. You're right. These rules are silly. Please just go along, but don't feel like you're a bad person because you don't agree with them, because I don't agree with them either.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so important to have those kind of discussions.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people would just absorb it.
I totally agree. My three youngest kids still go to a little private church, Baptist school in our neighborhood, and we've had many conversations like this. Even when they'll come home with Bible homework, some of
Mm-hmm.
the theology in their Bible homework is, I personally don't agree with it. And so
Right.
then I'll let them know, this is one idea of how to interpret this story. But did
Right.
you know that there are other Bible scholars and other thought, lines of thinking that offer these other perspectives? And you need to know that, because there's just so much richness,
Right.
and we don't want to just like think that this one is right just because it's the one that you're being presented at school. So
Right.
that's the only way I can justify putting them in that school. But they've grown up in there, and I don't want to, they love it there, which I love. And that,
Yeah.
they've have community there, and a lot of friends there. So I'm not going to pull them out. But anyway, it's very interesting. And I think those conversations are good, actually.
Yeah.
I think it's
As long as
almost
we
like
have them.
vaccinating them against stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Give
agree.
them small doses and then talk about it. So,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say for someone who is starting to recognize that this is, a part of their lives? What would you recommend as far as initial steps for them, maybe to address it in their own lives? And then also about people who are maybe out of those environments now, but they're trying to recover. I know some people are doing a lot of what, the buzzword is deconstruction. They might be not going to church anymore. Maybe, I
Yeah.
mean, I know some people who are really angry and they're just like, I will never go to church again. I don't go to church anymore. I'm not angry about it. I think I was for a while, but I don't feel any
Mm-hmm.
anger about it anymore. I just feel empowered that this is a choice that I'm making for now. Um, but how can they, I guess, take steps to get out if they want to, or stay if they want to? And then how, if they're already out, how can they do that recovery work? Because this is not just about their church attendance. I think this also encompasses their relationship with God. And some people maybe don't want church anymore, but they still want to maintain their relationship with,
Mm-hmm.
with God, and they still want to maintain all the best parts of their faith. I know that's
Yeah.
kind of a big question, but
Yeah, there's a lot of, you're going to have to follow up because you asked a few questions there. But let
okay.
me start with the one. So if people are listening to this and they're going, oh, you know, I haven't questioned my church and I have felt uncomfortable and, oh, maybe there's something here to take a look at. So um, I would recommend a few things. One, just to take a break, just step away from church. You know, sometimes Christians live in a bubble and oftentimes, and we don't know what else is out there because we've just been doing the same thing for decades. And so take a break and maybe read a book about spiritual abuse, you know, get some familiarity, like what's this all about? You know, is this something that could be true in my life? You know, maybe the things I'm feeling uncomfortable about are because they're wrong and I never thought that they might be wrong. I just assumed that I must be wrong. So, you know, maybe read a book or listen to the podcast. There's a number of podcasts that talk about these things, hear people's stories on these podcasts, like what they came out of. And you might recognize that their story is like your story and you might learn from them.
Yeah.
You might want to attend different churches too, just to see how different churches approach the same topics. For example, I know when we were raising money in our church for a capital campaign, and a lot of times when you go through a capital campaign, there's a lot of pressure put on people. There's a lot of guilt put on people to make them give more or to shame them if they don't give or don't give enough. And we made it very clear whenever we asked for money, we said, you know, this is an opportunity. And this is an opportunity for us to build this structure. But you know what? God will use us whether we have the structure or not. So if you don't feel inclined to give, that is totally okay. But if you're excited about it, we hope you will give. And this is how you can give.
Mm-hmm.
And people would come up to me afterwards and said, that was so refreshing. I've never heard anyone talk about that before. I've always been guilted into giving. No one's ever told me that I didn't have to give in church.
Yeah.
And so I think when you go to a different church and you see how different, similar topics are approached in different ways, you might go, oh, I didn't realize there were different ways to approach these things.
Yeah.
So I think when you take that time away and then maybe you go back into your church setting and then you have fresh eyes to maybe see things that you never saw before. So those are just some of the things that I'd recommend if you're questioning what might be going on at your church.
Yeah, I love that. That's I think getting away can be the beginning of a healing process. That's a great
Mm-hmm.
idea. So what about people who are out? I do know that we have many listeners who no longer go to church. Maybe they were excommunicated too, or maybe they
Yeah.
just maybe their churches, I think a lot of them, their churches didn't excommunicate them, didn't go to that extent, but they still mistreated them and kind of treat them like a pariah now because they're getting divorced or because they're separated from their husband or whatever. So how can they heal from just not just that, but also the abusive thinking that they've had their whole, for maybe decades in the religious environment that they were in? How can they heal from the spiritual abuse, I guess?
Yeah. And that's, well, I was looking through some of the comments on my YouTube channel today, and someone just wrote today talking about another terrible experience. And my heart just breaks. And I was just praying, like, God, how can I reach more people? Because there's so many people who are just stranded in various ways. They've lost their fellowship and they've even lost their interest. I mean, some people don't even want to, once they find out that I'm a pastor, it's like, oh, he doesn't have anything that I want to hear if he's a pastor.
Yeah.
I would disagree with that. And because I am a pastor, I am intimately involved and have knowledge of what the problem is. So I think I can speak to it in a way that a lot of people can't. But anyways, as far as what you might want to do if you're out and maybe you feel like you need healing, I can mention a few things. I do have a 4-part series in my YouTube channel. It's free. So you can just go there and it talks about steps you can take to find healing. There's a
What is
group
it called? Can you tell us what it's called? Like, how will they? I'll put a link to it as well, but just let's verbally say.
I think it's simply how to recover from spiritual abuse.
Okay.
Yeah. and I have a, a, a playlist just for spiritual abuse on my YouTube channel. So you can just click through some different things that I've presented there.
What is the name of your YouTube channel?
It's just YouTube with a slash F Remy D.
MD. Okay. All right. F as in frog?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
So that's
Okay.
one thing you can
That's
go
one thing.
there. Those are all very brief, but they're meant to get you started in the right direction.
Okay.
There's a group that I've become acquainted with recently called Be Emboldened. So it's B like BE emboldened.com. And they have some online groups that look very helpful. I'm not real intimately involved with have intimate knowledge of them, but as I peruse their website and so forth, it looked like a good resource to go to if you want some help on specific issues.
Okay.
Um, I mentioned that I do coach people, so I'm happy to. You can go to my website at readingremy.com and you can sign up for a coaching session. And I offer a 15-minute free introductory session just to get to know me a little bit and find out if coaching is a good step for you. And I recommend going to a therapist. A lot of times people get involved in spiritually abusive situations just because of their thinking. And they're prone to subject themselves to abusive people and they don't see it. And so maybe if they can, a therapist might be able to help them see what it is about them that was open to an abusive setting like they entered into.
Yeah, that's good advice, actually. Um,
Look for someone who has experience with spiritual abuse. A lot of people are clueless. They've never even heard the term spiritual abuse. So I'd look for someone who understands it.
yeah. Yeah. I'll throw in my Flying Free program too. We do talk about spiritual abuse. There's a whole class about it in the Flying Free program, and we have spaces in our private forum where we have discussions about that as well. We have a woman, a coach in our program who she's gone to seminary, and we kind of jokingly referred to her as our community pastor because she really does kind of play a pastoral role in our community. And she is she's smart as a whip, and she's also just very discerning when it comes to all of these issues
That's
and the
great.
Bible. She understands the Bible really well. And anyway, she's been a huge help for all of us too.
Good.
So okay, so I guess there was one other thing I wanted to talk about, and then we can
Yeah.
close.
Okay.
Um, have you gotten any flack from other churches or pastors or whatever for what you do? Or what has been the reception maybe amongst your peers as a pastor?
Um, Not that I'm aware of. Maybe
Okay.
they're talking behind their back. I know when I had my book Broken Trust translated into Spanish and by a Spanish pastor that I'm friends with down in Chile, and when he was talking about it, he said, "You know, Remy, this is a really controversial book." I go, "Really?" I mean, I'm kind of clueless to that. I go, "Really? Why? It seems kind of straightforward to me." He goes, "Well, this is going to challenge a lot of pastors." And I said, "Well, I hope so. I mean, I don't, but I don't, the book really wasn't written for pastors. I mean, I hope they would read it because it would sensitize them to how they might be toxic or abusive. So I think it'd be great if pastors did read it, but it wasn't written for them. It was written for the hurting people who want to know what to do next."
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's so funny that, like your work and my work is very controversial for the abusers.
Right. Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
it's kind of a no-brainer for all the victims. So,
Yeah, I mean, I did a series. I've taught on spiritual abuse, actually not in this country, but to pastors in Mexico and in Chile as well. Um, and they're all smiles when I do the teaching and agree. But from what I understand, there's a lot of abuse in those churches that I was speaking to. So it's
yeah.
like I don't know if anyone's hearing me from a pastoral standpoint.
Yeah, I think some people, I think like if someone's a true bona fide abuser, I think they're so blind to that
Mhm.
they will, project that on everyone else and say,
Right.
everyone else is abusive, but they won't be able to see for themselves how they're actually perpetrating on other people. But
Mhm.
which is why I think they can sometimes smile unless you actually confront them specifically about what they're doing. And then that's
Yeah.
when you get a little bit of a blowback. But
Yeah.
anyway, this has been very helpful. I can highly recommend and endorse Broken Trust and I have, it's actually one of the books that I recommend in my program in the spiritual abuse section. So,
Mhm.
um, and it's been great to actually meet you and to know
Yeah.
that you are in my backyard. And Remy
We're
is
30
part
minutes
of a
away.
church. I've thought about maybe I should go visit Remy's church, but I'm not quite there yet. Maybe someday. We'll see.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Remy, for being part of this conversation. It's been great to meet you.
It's been a lot of fun, Natalie. It's nice to meet you too.